Welcome back. Christian support of Trump. I know a lot of you check that. Maybe some of you might be saying right now, why are you taking this on? Well, a guy who I like, who happens to be a frequent guest on this show, recently wrote a column by the title, Why a Bible-Believing Christian Supports Trump. And we're talking about Rod Thompson, of course, who describes his ongoing arguments with other Christians who disagree with him, who look at the number of times the president has been married, the allegations of harassment, his sometimes vulgar language, and his comments about women as the reason they don't support Trump. But Rod writes, quote, I understand the discomfort with his verbiage and the way he comports himself. Same here. It can really be distasteful to me, but how could that possibly be more important than what he is actually doing for the country? And joining us for more is Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com, Reverend Russell Meyer, the Executive Director of the Florida Council of Churches, and another guy who I like and call a friend, and Frank Alcock, who is one of my best friends, a political science professor at New College. Hey, Rod, let me see if I got this correct. You told Adam it's not about what the president does in his personal life, it's about his ability to move the country forward. But a lot of people argue what the president's policies that he is pushing along would actually move the country back, not forward.
Right. Well, I disagree if we're looking at forward as equating to what's best for Americans, because I think that we've mistaken the place and the role of the president in the country. He's the chief executive. He's meant to faithfully execute the laws of the land, which some have done better than others. Commander-in-chief appoints judges. You know, there's a handful of things that he's supposed to be doing. He is not supposed to be a moral leader, a spiritual leader, a father figure. He's not supposed to be a national emoter in times of catastrophe. I see no reason why we should have a president going after a hurricane and handing out water so he can show how he cares. I think that we put the president in the wrong role when we look at him that way. And so if we are looking at him for appropriate moral leadership, we are looking to the wrong places. We should be looking to pastors, reverends, priests, rabbis, imams, whatever your faith is. That's where you look for those things.
There's a pretty good pastor sitting right next to you right now, Reverend Meyer. Your objection to President Trump, is it based, what percentage of it is based in terms of his moral failings, his marriages, the charges of sexual harassment, his vulgarity, or his policies?
It's wrapped up into a bundle. I don't know how you separate them out. And so there are policies that are harming people right now today. Those policies are perhaps not so much different as the way he conducted his businesses and left many of his vendors without full payment, saying, sue me if you don't like the way I'm settling with this. So there's a nature in him of the way he interacts with others that he perceives as his adversary. As the President of the United States, he's the president of all of us. None of us are his adversaries. And so when he calls out certain parts of the country as treasonous or as enemies of the state, he's dividing Americans against Americans. And that can be traced to a whole lot of other behaviors in his past.
Frank, the evangelical community has always had, or at least in the last several decades, a really important role in electing a president. It seemed to have waned a little bit in the late 1990s and early 2000s, but is there any way to underestimate how important the evangelical Christian community is to President Trump's base?
No, about a quarter, 25% of Americans identify with white evangelical Christians. They are, and it works through the churches, but it's one of the most highly organized networks, one of the most politically mobilized groups in America. So they're extremely important with respect to electoral outcomes. I would, however, caution people to read too much into just the religious part. I do think that highly religious people are having a significant problem with some of the dissonance that we're talking about. But I think the evangelical label it's a proxy for a cultural group that in having somebody at the vanguard of their movement, that's what's most important to them. And so sometimes it manifests on things like the Tea Party, but it does make sense, I think, if you break it down.
We're just getting warmed up, and we'll have much more on the Christian support for Trump right after we check the first alert weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about Christian support for President Trump, and joining us for more is Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com, Reverend Russell Meyer, the Executive Director of the Florida Council of Churches, and Frank Alcock, a political science professor at New College. Gentlemen, CNN did this a really interesting story a while back, just a week or two ago, where they went out and interviewed a number of evangelical women who talking about President Trump. Let's take a short look at what they said.
We care about jobs, we care about the economy, safety. That's what we care about. It's not relevant.
It doesn't matter, because that's what Christianity is about. It's all about forgiveness, it's all about new beginnings, it's all about starting over. So it is irrelevant to me about what he did in 2006.
Of course, that was after the reports came out about the president's affair with a porn star years ago, before he became president. But Reverend Meyer, that story and the comments that some in the evangelical community made about it really has kind of lingered in the news. As we mentioned earlier in the show, some are giving the president a mulligan for that personal failing, if it is true. Would you?
Well, this isn't golf on Saturday afternoon, cigars and beers on the greens with your buddies. This is public life. And not only is it public life, it's the most public office on the face of the planet. And so Me Too really counts here. We have shifted over the last couple of years in a really big way. We're not going back on Me Too. It would be very helpful for this president to come out and be very clean. If forgiveness is there, in the Christian tradition, repentance and amendment of life are ingredients for how forgiveness unfolds in a person's life. It would be very helpful for him to embrace the Me Too and come out and talk about amendment of life.
But you know, there are a lot of people who are watching this tonight who are probably saying to their televisions right now, when Bill Clinton was president and we went through the Monica Lewinsky affair, a lot of people on the left did not call the president out for those moral failings.
There were people who called President Clinton out. At the end of the day, President Clinton was tried in the Congress for misdemeanors and high crimes and found that he had not committed. He was acquitted of misdemeanors and high crimes. His behavior with Monica Lewinsky is reprehensible and is never defensible. And in this day and age, if that were to happen here, the outcome might be very different. We need to have strong rules that say people in authority cannot use their authority for sexual favors.
Rod, let me ask you about this, because when you see Christian defense of President Trump, despite the allegations, the marriages, the language, and so forth, you know, on the other hand, a lot of people say, you know, there were a lot of people who openly questioned whether Barack Obama was a Christian, and that is, you know, no matter what you think of his policies, the man did not speak publicly in the same way that the president does. There's certainly no question about how he treated his wife and other women, and it does raise the issue about hypocrisy.
So, well, what it raises the issue to me is it goes exactly back to my point here, and that is that Barack Obama, in my estimation, he said he's a Christian. I leave it at that. I take him at his word. He seemed to me to be a loving father, a devoted husband, a good family man, an excellent example in that respect and all. I think he wasn't a good president for the country because of his policies. I would go further in the presidential comparisons to sort of buttress my case here to say that probably the most morally Christian president we've had in modern times is Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a Bible teacher. I mean, evangelical. I mean, no. Basically, he believes exactly what I believe, as best I can tell. And Habitat for Humanity he's been faithful with for decades afterwards. But it's also pretty universally accepted that he was really not a good president at all. than when I go to, but wait, let me finish my point if I might. But I go to Bill Clinton. And so I like to stick with the Democrats here because it kind of makes the case. Bill Clinton, I think, was a morally reprehensible man. I think he was a sexual predator. I think just looking at Monica Lewinsky is nowhere near enough of the picture. When you look at all the various women, I mean, this is really not a moral man. In office, before office, I don't know about afterwards, but it doesn't sound like it. However, I don't think Bill Clinton was that bad a president. I would take Bill Clinton over Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama as president, despite my assessment that he is a morally inferior man personally than either of them.
Frank, Rod is basically saying we should not look to our presidents for their moral leadership. But when I look back at the presidents in my lifetime and even before, going back to FDR at least, we did look at them as leaders, no matter a number of them, if not all, had some moral failings.
Yeah, I think moral character matters. So I disagree with Rod and who I would hold up as exemplars as the presidency, but I think Rod's argument exemplifies, I think, what you're seeing in terms of that ability to compartmentalize. And so I think largely for the evangelical Christian movement, 80%, I mean, they came out overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, and their support really hasn't been shaken revelation after revelation. And I think that's because Donald Trump says the things that they want to hear. I think it's probably more cultural than it is to some governance philosophy or even religious philosophy. But he says the things that they want to hear. He champions what they want championed. And there's just a monster mulligan. Whatever he does in his private life, it simply doesn't matter.
Reverend Meyer, and I know I asked you this kind of in a different way, but knowing you, I know that the biggest issue you take with President Trump is his policies.
It is his policies. So the fundamental question in the Bible concerning what a leader should do, the king, the prince, to use the language of biblical times, is to make certain that the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, the alien, the immigrant, have the same opportunities, are loved by the nation the way you would love your own cousin. That's the biblical standard. So when we talk about morality in the Bible, the standard of morality is a public morality. And so let's just look at DACA, for instance. The president terminated the DACA program on his own accord and then threw it to Congress and said, you guys need to fix this. Now, that was not an innocent move. Congress is dysfunctional right now because of the Hassert rule, which says in the GOP, it only applies in the GOP, that at least 50% of the party has to agree to something before it will even be voted on. There are a whole set of bipartisan policies that would be adopted tomorrow in both the House and the Senate if it weren't for the dysfunction within the leading party.
Well, let me put that to Rod. How do you jive what you read in the Bible that Reverend Meyer was talking about and your support for President Trump?
Right. So this is a principled position now, regardless of who's president. Reverend Meyer was talking about in James chapter 2, where it says, look after orphans and widows in their distress. That's exactly right. That's exactly what Christians are supposed to be doing. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, very high bar for all of us to be doing, turning the other cheek. When you look in Matthew, and
you can't say that this president, this man, turns the
Thank you.
Exactly the point. But this is continuing on my point. I'm not claiming that Trump is a Christian. I'm not claiming he needs to act like a Christian. He needs to act like our chief executive, and that's what he needs to be doing. Is he needs to be a good president. But the other is aimed at us as individual Christians. Nowhere in the Bible will you find God telling or Jesus saying how we are to act as government.
Right. Wait a second. We have to take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment. And our guest joined us for final thoughts. And Reverend Meyer, there was something you wanted to say.
So the position of Scripture goes way back. It's best illustrated by the Psalms, the royal Psalms that pray over and over again, give the king your justice, O Lord. And so the notion there is that the king, as the representative of the people in the government, is supposed to be living out the values in which the widow and the orphan and the stranger in the land, that everybody has a fair opportunity of the distribution of God's abundance in this creation. That's the fundamental way to judge a government as being moral or immoral. Jesus builds upon that prophetic tradition, and it goes through him all the way. It's why he attacks the temple, because it has forgotten its way.
Ron?
Right, so, and what Reverend Meyer's saying and what the Unitarian pastor was saying on there, I'm a little bit surprised at how much we want to infuse running government with church and with church teachings and policies. I was thinking that we wanted to separate those two. But on the individual issues within the scripture, he's right on the Psalms and teaching the kings. But if we go to Jesus' teachings, Jesus is all about the individual heart and where our heart is towards God, where our heart is towards fellow man. And so he asks us to feed the poor and to clothe the naked and to visit those in prison. And the reason he wants us to do that is because if there's a third party that can do it, we do not have to take responsibility individually for it.
That's the evangelical contortion of the
That's what the scripture says if you read the Bible.
That's the evangelical contortion of the scriptures. There are other Christian traditions that don't simply make it a matter of individualism.
Frank, has it always been this way, or is it more severe now in terms of our politics?
No, it's more severe now, if you haven't noticed. Just to sum up, I think if you're looking for religious principles in terms of a connection between evangelical support for Donald Trump or even governance philosophy, you're just going to be scratching your head. I think it comes back to cultural reasons. They've chosen this guy to lead the vanguard. He speaks their language, and they'll forgive just about anything.
All right, and we'll have to leave it there. But before we go, we want to share with you what some of you had to say about last night's show on us being just days away from another possible government shutdown. Less than a month ago, the government shut down for a couple of days. Back in 2013, there was a 16-day shutdown. Closing the government can affect you and your family and the military and more. So we went to Facebook to hear your thoughts about how a government shutdown would affect you. And Bob says, when a government shutdown impacts you, then you depend too much on the government. Time to shrink the government. Pete responds and says, if you are a military family not getting paid during a shutdown, are you too dependent on the government? And Robin says, I would like the Democrats to start acting like adults. And Kate responds, I would like the Republicans to start acting like human beings. Well, if you'd like to join the conversation on tonight's topic, just visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/mysuncoast.com.abc7. And FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. And for the latest on local breaking news, don't forget to download the updated version of our app. If your current app doesn't work, it's expired, just go to the App Store and re-download it by searching for WWSB or My Suncoast. We want to thank our guests for being here tonight, Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com, Reverend Russell Meyer, the Executive Director of the Florida Council of Churches, and Frank Alcock, a political science professor at New College.